The most courageous act is still to think for yourself, aloud. A quote by Coco Chanel. And it couldn't be more true than for my guest today, Sarah Alagroobi, who embodies strength, determination, and authenticity. Over a year ago, I came across an online platform called the Letters Project, which foregrounded anonymous letters written by young Arab men and women about socio-cultural issues in a way that was perhaps never seen or heard before. Sarah Alagroobi is the founder of the Letters Project and adorns many more titles. She's a multidisciplinary artist, author, researcher, educator, and now a podcast host for the Native Informant. From the other side, we are in conversation with the very dynamic Sarah Alagroobi. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. Sarah, I'm very intrigued to know how your beliefs and practices, socio-cultural, religious, in your childhood have gone on to define your identity, your values, and your worldview as a person that you are today.
It's an interesting question that you asked me from the jump, chasing back to my childhood. I was really fortunate and privileged enough to have a very dynamic childhood, predominantly raised in the West. Due to my father's work, I was constantly placed in situations and scenarios where I had to adapt and understand and really take on different cultures and identities of people around me. I was kind of forced into these circumstances where I met people who were different than me culturally, religiously, socio-culturally, socio-politically. And I learned to understand that there are things that are greater and more pressing that are outside of myself. And I learned to be tolerant and to be just and to be a person that really foregrounds the idea of diversity and the way that diversity in its truest form should be.
That's so interesting because that clearly gives an indication of why it is that what you're doing today, right? Mm. At the age of 6, you had a teacher write in your report card that Sarah follows the beat of her own drum. She's a force to be reckoned with, and she's a true leader. This is at the age of 6. How much of this is true to who you are today?
1001%. It was very interesting because at the time that I had read that quote, I think I was feeling very low on who I was as a person because I had constantly been in situations and circumstances that had either negated my existence for, whatever reason. And it put me in a situation where I thought, is what I am enough? Is my personality accepted within the society that I'm living in? Is it acceptable to be surrounded by people who constantly label you as a naysayer or constantly label you as a contrarian? And, for whatever reason, I kept thinking to myself, like, is that bad? Am I really all of these things? Have I always been like that? And then, by the grace of God, when I saw that report card, I thought to myself, this was a kind reminder that the universe was telling me,
it's all right to be you.
Exactly. And you have remained radically consistent your entire life and you haven't steered away from the core essence of who you are as a person.
And I think that's just so powerful. Sarah, I have spent over 5 decades here. And in my experience of interacting with Emirati women, which has largely been in the sphere of corporate life, I have known them to be hardworking, ambitious, and rather diligent in ways that they work. But just the same, I felt that there is sort of a veneer beyond which you can't see. And what struck me about the Letters Project was the fact that Emirati women were raising socio-cultural issues, that of misogyny, patriarchy, gender equality, which were just the same that women from my part of the world are experiencing. Because up until then, the Emirati woman for me was a bit enigmatic. And here you are, breaking almost the fourth wall to address these issues. Why do you think there are less voices that are echoing the issues you're addressing?
I think the thing that drives the Letters Project as a safe space is the fact that it's anonymous. I think people seek refuge in anonymity because when you think about the idea of the Letters Project, what it really is doing is it's providing that protective veneer that you spoke of. You spoke of a veneer, but this is rather a protective veneer. And that veneer allows to pull back on the things that make the certain, I guess you would say, target points or characteristics or attributes that someone might associate or affiliate with a certain type of person or ethnicity. And it pushes that back and it leads in with the actual universal experience, which is pain or grief or sadness or happiness or joy or love or all of these different motifs that we speak of regularly, irrespective of religion, race or gender. And
I think that's what's transcended so clearly, because that's the appeal of the Letters Project.
Absolutely. And so women who are part of the region, not just Emirati women, just really saw that as an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm going to put everything about me, let it fall by the wayside, and let me lead with a certain experience that I've gone through, and to test the markers to see just how universal it is. And it ultimately ends up that you get people from all over the world flocking together and realizing that they all share in the same experience.
There's a collective sense of that pain Absolutely. And that joy and then the challenges that you face. One of the things that I also feel really strongly about, Sarah, are gender roles and gender equality when we speak of it. I would define gender equality in a way that I believe that it's on to us to challenge the status quo of patriarchal norms. And it's not about displacing men, but it is about firmly placing ourselves in that common space with equal conviction and comfort. I also believe that as women, we do speak about gender equality largely in the space of work. And what I find a huge dichotomy is that the roles at home are gendered with clearly entrenched in the framework of patriarchal thinking. And I do want to understand from you, where is it that we can find this breaking and the shift happening where it almost transcends beyond workspace and we can make the difference that we want to in bringing in gender equality in our home?
It's interesting that you should ask that, because I think we speak about whether it's through patriarchal norms and values that have been, passed down from generation to generation. I'd said this before and I'll, say it again. It is heavily ancestral and is heavily in the, it heavily resides in the nuance. When you feel like there are certain cultural values, norms and values that have been passed down from generation to generation, you have to be willing to put a step forward to break the chain of ancestral trauma or break the chain of ancestral legacies that go beyond gender, that go beyond these norms and values. And for me, the way that I see it is we are living at a time where there is no excuse, because we are so privileged to be exposed to so many different cultural norms and values, that if something doesn't reside with you, it is your responsibility and it is your obligation for your own sense and for your own, for the next generation after you, to be able to draw a hard line of where you feel like it doesn't serve you.
Sure.
But the way that I see it, especially when it comes to these experiences that you speak of, they are highly complex, and also they require tiny, small acts of service that need to build up over time, because things don't happen overnight. You have to shift the point of origin.
Sure. And what would be these acts of service? Could you give us an example of something that breaks this through? You'd also mentioned in one of your interviews that, and I found that quite potent as well, because you said women are the backbone of patriarchy. How's that?
I believe that for women, we allow things to be done to us when we, in fact, are when we think about women, okay, so if I break it down, when we think about men and women, I would describe men as protagonists and women are gatekeepers.
Sure.
And so when women are placed within specific frameworks that they operate in, it is up to them to be able to remove themselves from being the architect of their own misfortune. They design the space that they reside in. They figure out what that blueprint is because we are the givers of life. So we decide, first and foremost, if you think about it just purely from a mating point of view, we decide who our partner is going to be and we set out what the next generation is going to be. So why does that line of logic not apply to other aspects of our lives? Whether it's our family, whether it's with friends, whether it's at work, we make the decisions of what works for us. And so the way that I see it, the patriarchy only exists if you allow it to exist. And I think that the way that I see women, because we are such multifaceted, complex creatures, we have the ability to bend and yield in ways that I think men can't. And it comes from the experience of, well, I've always said this and I'll say it again, it really is better to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. And I think with women, we don't really need to ask permission. And that's why whether we are the gatekeepers, we can remain the gatekeepers, or we can be the people that foreground whatever decisions that we want to make in society. That's the way I see it.
You know, I also believe that one of the things that we are burdened with, Sarah, as women, and I completely understand when you say things like, we need to forge our own paths. And if that means that we need to break away from the shackles of patriarchy, it's really on to us.
Mm-hmm.
But I also believe that it's a social construct that we are burdened with, or rather crowned with, the burden of being a superwoman or being a woman of resilience. And that's almost taking it to the point that now you've got to live up to this. And that, I think, is grossly unfair, because then there is no room for us to forgive ourselves if we go astray, and astray in the way that if you're just human to it. And I think this is, again, an important aspect which we need to address, that it's okay not to get it right all the time. It's about getting better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the biggest people that are, I guess, hard on each other are women, and women on women as well. And I think that comes from, I guess, internalized misogyny. It comes from their own upbringing, that if you are being targeted for whatever reason through a specific experience, that you are morally obligated to course correct, and that you have to hold other women accountable for course correcting. But it's often through the lens of a man that you are course correcting.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about the patriarchy, and I find this really interesting, when I have conversations with people, especially outside of an Arab or, I guess, Asian-centric discussion,
Sure.
patriarchy looks very different for them. And it's not necessarily the same when they think about what it means to be under the ruling thumb of the patriarchal system. For us, it's about the way our general day-to-day that we are with the opposite gender. It's the way that men perceive women in society. It's the way that men perceive women at home. And that, you know, in a way we are encouraged to be, you know, the Janes of all trades, but masters of none. But then we're vilified if we don't present the best versions of those.
That's expected of us.
Absolutely. And I think that the only way that we can really start to shift this, I guess, point of origin or pivot this point of origin, is to allow ourselves the ability to recognize that failure is not failure. It is just a stepping stone in the right direction to something better.
Absolutely, and that's so well put. Has this also been your experience, Sarah, about women not turning up for you?
Oh, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, I've been in many circumstances where to be a woman, if I was to unpack one of the main aspects of being a woman, it's to be inherently agreeable. And I'm quite a disagreeable person. So I don't follow things blindly. I don't allow for people to dictate the way that I should behave or the way that I should act. I definitely have a voice, and you hear it loud and proud. And even if you didn't ask for it, you're going to hear it. And I think that because we live in a society that cushions the idea of what a proper woman should be, don't be disagreeable, don't be problematic, don't be boastful, don't be this, don't be that. And the perfect example, and I've said this on multiple occasions, when a woman is assertive, she's often viewed through the lens of being bossy.
Yes,
and so for me, the largest critics I've faced are other women, because they have allowed for other aspects of society to dictate the way that they should be. So when they see somebody going against the grain, for them it's they feel that it's seen as a disruption. A disruption to the status quo. And for women, because we are so fluid in the way that we present ourselves, if we go against that order, it is viewed through a lens of testing the waters, that we walk a very, very fine line between order and chaos.
Right.
And for me, I invite that line, at any stance. I really don't mind being defined as somebody that walks a fine line between order and chaos. I think that's what makes women beautiful, ultimately.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Does anything scare you?
Nothing scares me. When I look back on the way that my personality has been viewed in society, it's often met with resistance. And the reason why it's met with resistance is because when you come up across somebody who has a disruptive personality, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you fear it. And if you fear it, you will do whatever you can to fight against it.
You'll resist it.
Absolutely. And for me, why should I live in fear? Or why should I allow for the aspects of the unknown to make someone fearful of me, or for me to be inherently fearful as well? I invite something that doesn't align with my thoughts and my ideologies. And I think that the more that we can sway in that direction, and that's the sort of nature of the Letters Project, it's tapping in or just nudging the idea of an alternative narrative, a counter narrative, just to get the conversation going. Because if you don't understand it, you're just ultimately going to fear it. And so once you start to learn and comprehend these different aspects of society, there's no longer fear. And then there's no need also to go on the attack. You can actually invite those criticisms to exist in harmony with things that go against it. Like, it's almost a perfect dichotomy, perfect duality.
I can only just reiterate the fact that my podcast, the ethos of it is about celebrating contrarian daredevils like yourself, because these are conversations that perhaps are difficult for people to have, but they're just as important for us to have if we want to see some kind of change. So thank you for doing what you do, Sarah.
Thank you.
Intersectionality is an important aspect of gender activism. How do you believe that issues such as race, class, and other identities intersect with gender roles and misogyny?
I think ultimately with intersectionality, the apex of intersectionality really allows universality to these I guess, extensions that you speak of.
Sure.
But for the way that I see it, especially with something like the Letters Project, is that it applies to basic thoughts and ideologies in a way that allow for a more nuanced discussion. Now, the way that I see intersectionality is that it embraces the complexities of people's identity. If we are at a time, even just being on social media, we are often asked to oversimplify the way in which we carry ourselves.
Absolutely.
Or at least place ourselves within a binary. You either like something or you don't like something. You like a photo, you don't like a photo. You have an opinion, I either agree with you or I don't, without the context, without the cushioning of that kind of conversation. And with intersectionality,
there is this overarching cancel culture that exists.
Absolutely. And I think with something like intersectionality, it gives grace to conversational dynamics that really unpack what it means to be either somebody within a specific class and how that relates to a specific gender or a specific ethnicity, and how their experience, however nuanced it may be, is actually inherently quite universal. And so when we think about that, just from the perspective of social dynamics or even gender dynamics, we really have to recognize that when we speak of gender, race, class, and all of those things that fall within under that umbrella, the conversation often turns to there are polarities to that conversation. And what intersectionality advises is that you can sit in that gray area quite comfortably. You don't have to be either black or white in that. And that gray area is actually where the meat of the conversation happens. It's where we really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what it means to be part of a specific group or a specific structure. So that's the sort of way that I see how intersectionality plays. But when you think about it in terms of society just echoes the way that we view intersectionality. And some people don't like to have that as part of the conversation. Yeah. They want to dismiss it. And, for all intents and purposes, it's their business to do so. But I think that when you bring out these conversations or you foreground them, it really does play the role in the way that you receive that kind of information, or you receive that dynamic that you're speaking about. And I'm only speaking about it in terms of the Letters Project because that's a great form of reference. Yeah. But the way that I see, you had mentioned all of these different things, whether it's race, religion, orientation, class, all of that. I think from somebody who's incredibly privileged and has grown up in a very privileged life and with many different opportunities that have been handed to me, I understand why certain conversations under the umbrella of certain classes might not be well received, because it is veneered or glossed over through the lens of high society or upper class society. And so certain topics of conversation might not appeal to other classes. Like, why would I worry about such, first world problems that you deal with? But I think what's important is to get the conversation going and what the differences are. What is that gray area that we speak of? How can we fortify a connection or draw a correlation between that class and this class? Like, how does that conversation come to be? And so when you're looking at it from the outside in as well as the inside out, it really does bring for a really interesting, complex narrative, to say the least.
I find this so interesting, Sarah, because you clearly have set the context for the fact that these conversations that you are putting in the prism with which you see, you don't for a moment discount the fact that you come from a position of privilege.
Absolutely.
Then why is this so important for you to do what you're doing?
Because I think about it from a very, Emma Watson said it really greatly, that if not now, then when? And if not me, then who? And I think it's because if you are naturally an industrious person and you kind of lead the trenches and are seen for whatever reason as like a social martyr to the cause, then you have to be willing to put your feelings aside and to know that this is hopefully going to open up the types of conversations that you wish you had or were missing in some aspect of your life as a child or as a young adult. And for me, these conversations were always so rich and flavorful whenever I was around friends and family. But I always called into question as to why they happened behind closed doors or why they were never discussed openly, because, the more the merrier. Let's all get into the conversation and discuss it. And to know that there were so many social, triggers or pain points, as you had mentioned earlier in our private discussion, that, they're self-inflicted. We put them on ourselves. So if we just eliminate those and start having those conversations, we will more likely than not, and more often than not, come to a viable solution. And I think when we're part of a society where we like to put a Band-Aid on something and not deal with the problem itself, just the symptom of the problem, then we're not really advocating for a solution. We're just, asking for this kind of regurgitation of the same issues over and over again. And so when you have conversations, whether they're on the Native Informant or on the Letters Project, what you're doing is you're kind of putting a blockade to stopping that cycle of not actually finding a solution. Right. And so, yeah.
Does this tire you, or do you become impatient because you're not seeing the change that you so desire to see?
The change will not be with me. It will be with the next generation. Someone had asked me before and the same way that you had asked me, well, then why do you do the Letters Project? Why do you have the conversations on the Native Informant? Part of it is that it's not about me. It's never been about me. It's about the people, and it's about how the people perceive these conversations. I have heard many a time that the Letters Project has been a safe space for people to seek refuge in the types of conversations they wish they had, or the shoulder that they wish they could have cried on, or the friend that was there that was coming from a place of love, not from a place of fear or a place of judgment. And so
it must be so cathartic for some of them who've held these feelings for so long. And here now is a way for them to really come out in the open and express what they actually feel and believe.
Absolutely. And people from the Letters Project and the Native Informant, they've found each other. They've found like-minded individuals that think the same way as they do and act the same way as they do. And they said, okay, finally, I found my tribe. I found the people that I wish I could connect.
Thank God for that.
Yes. And I think one of my friends was dealing with an issue where she was surrounding herself with people that she really didn't align herself with on multiple stages, and I asked her, and I said, "Is this your tribe? Is this the people that are your ride or die?" I said, "Above everything, know your tribe and know who you want to surround yourself with." And I think that for me, I have been an extension of people's tribes because they needed that voice of reason, or they needed that shoulder to cry on, or they just needed somebody that doesn't have to be a Greek chorus to them, that just echoes what they want to discuss and feel, but actually calls them out on things, because that's what I appreciate in my friends. And they were able to foster their own tribes. So for me, I think of the idea of tribe as an overarching protection to the way that I navigate my life.
I could easily be this friend of yours because every word is something that resonates with me. It's been a personal struggle to be able to find your tribe without questioning your own identity. And just the whole aspect of accepting who you are, I think, is the first step. Mm-hmm. And then obviously accepting yourself unapologetically, unabashedly is what the game is.
Absolutely.
And then when you find yourself and you find your voice and you find your tribe, it's a celebration of life. There is a very well-known poet in India who does who did a lot of work on a social level to change and again question the social construct. And in an interview, he was asked that everything that you seem to be doing right now for change, does it not irk you that you're not seeing the needle shift? And he said something that I'm reminded of what you've said, that when you work for change, don't expect to see it in your lifetime, because this is about many lifetimes that you will see it come into fruition. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the beauty of what you're doing as well.
Absolutely.
Sarah, I also want to touch and touch upon something that you raised in the Native Informant in your podcast about masculinity and femininity, and you talked about how those definitions are pretty much handed down to us. And within the spectrum of both of this, I believe the subject of vulnerability also needs to be addressed because we practice it with such restraint. Again, like you mentioned, there is such a binary process that social media thrives on, that vulnerability just doesn't seem to fit within that framework. We've got to protect ourselves from who really we are, and we've got to show this glossy picture of how wonderful our lives are. Why do you think it's so difficult for us to be coming out as being real us and vulnerable us?
I think when we discuss vulnerability in society, we can come at it from the statement that I made earlier on, which is society follows a specific blueprint where you have certain metric systems that help us quantify and qualify the way that we understand the world around us. And I think that when you're asking vulnerability to be foregrounded, you're asking yourself to move away from a metric system that doesn't or cannot define who you are. You are never just the whole, you are the sum of all parts. And those parts should not have a strange way of measuring it that follows a specific standard. And so when you talk about vulnerability in identity or vulnerability in society, you can have men that are vulnerable. You can have women that are inherently masculine. You can have men that by and large are more agreeable than disagreeable. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we want to be able to allow for places for those people to exist. We have to carve out those places for people to exist on a fundamental level, on a cellular level, because that's what enriches the environment. That's what allows vulnerability to feel safe enough to be leaned into. And it's so interesting that you should say, when we talk about the polarities of masculine and feminine, there's a lot of people out there that would make that argument and say that masculinity is very stoic. You have to follow a very certain assertive way of thinking and feeling, and it's almost void of emotion. It's void of vulnerability.
Yeah. Because that's what a strong man's got to be.
Absolutely. But when I did the podcast with Corey, he had mentioned that there is a time and a place for everything, but that doesn't eliminate vulnerability out of the conversation. It just says that when we talk about control and remember when I said we walk a fine line between order and chaos, it's being able to allow temperance to sit comfortably between that order and chaos, that you fundamentally decide when are you going to lean into that order and when are you going to lean into that chaos. And with vulnerability, you can have the chaos, but you can have the order cushioning it or supporting it. And I think that's what he meant when he spoke of men being vulnerable, that you can be chaotic in your emotions, but you need to have some structure, some framework to build upon it so that vulnerability isn't, just erratic and all over the place. It has to have a sense of direction, because he stresses on solution orientation. We have to come up with solutions. We can't sit around the problem. You can't wallow in the misery. With vulnerability, yes, granted, it's invited. It should be part of the conversation. But you should never just sit in the underbelly of vulnerability and call it a day. Like, where's the solution? How are we going to solve the issue? How are we going to learn from it?
Sarah, I feel like we can keep talking because there's so many things that we can still keep uncovering and unveiling, and it's also exciting. But I do also want to get to the other role that you've assumed, that of an author.
Mm-hmm.
I am very excited to start reading the book Fire and Silk that you've penned down. Would you tell us a little bit about what took for you to write this book? What were the makings of it?
Fire and Silk was a cathartic journey of me trying to unpack a very interesting experience that I went through in my life. I didn't know quite how to release it. And normally I put brush to canvas, but I thought putting pen to paper might actually be a better idea.
And has that happened?
Has it happened before?
No, has that worked for you?
Yes, absolutely. And I felt only until I had written the last word was I able to go, okay, that's why it happened. It was the solution for many, many problems that I never even knew were such problems until I finished writing the book.
Wonderful.
It revealed so many aspects of myself, and it really embraced the multifaceted version of my experience, and it sort of compacted into this book. And it took around 2 years to write, and about 6 months to a year to kind of go through all of the teething. But I remember having a very love-hate relationship with it. There was a point where I was like, oh, I just hate this book. I never want to see it again. But yeah, it was an interesting experience, to say the least.
I'm very excited to dig my teeth in it. And as I do, I will share my feedback.
Absolutely, yes. I can't wait for it.
Sarah, which book is your favorite one?
My favorite book would probably be The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And I know it's a controversial book. A lot of people have, feelings and thoughts about its political undertones and what it stands for. But for me, it really is the narrative of the book that resonates with me, and the protagonist, Howard Rourke. I really feel that his character resonates with the way that I live my life. He goes through so many trials, so many tribulations. He faces so many obstacles in his lifetime. And in the beginning of the book, actually in the opening chapter, he says, what am I to do? Live for 60 years? And if I live for 60 years, am I condemning myself to 60 years of torture if I'm not doing what I love? I inherit nothing, and I do not live by standards. I set my own standards. And he says also that I stand at the end of no tradition, but perhaps the beginning of a new one. And so if I was
incredibly beautiful.
Yeah, if I was to say anything to people who are listening, is that you ultimately inherit nothing. You have to stand at the end of your own tradition, because you might be at the standard of an old tradition, but perhaps this is the beginning of a new one.
Absolutely. Sarah, if I was to ask you what your 3 non-negotiables are that you practice every day, and again, you could have more than 3, but if you have 3 that you can tell us, we'd love to hear that.
For me, it's more of a motto. The non-negotiable, and this is what I say to my friends as well, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. And so when you speak about a certain topic, speak with conviction. That would probably be my second one. And a non-negotiable as well is to never make excuses for somebody who is unwilling to make excuses for themselves. And for me, I see the non-negotiables as ways of living your life. But I found that if I live my life that way, I don't allow people to dictate how I feel, never make excuses for somebody or for experiences, and also to ensure that you stand always as tall and proud from a position of authenticity and genuine rapport, then everything else falls by the wayside.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Sarah, if there was one single thing that you could tell every human being in the world, what would it be?
One single thing that I could tell: you are not always right. I think that's probably it, because a lot of the hate and the stress and the devastation that we've experienced is coming often from a place of not understanding. You're always being misunderstood. And you have to be willing to put your ego aside and to realize sometimes that you're not always right. And that maybe, just maybe, the perception of things or the position that you have taken is not necessarily the correct one. Be open and receptive to other experiences, other thoughts, ideas, etc. So, yeah.
Life is work in progress.
Absolutely.
She is a thunderstorm for the ground that understands the blessings of her rain. Thank you, Sarah, for coming and sharing your story from the other side. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.